Good afternoon, everyone. If you could please take your seats, we're going to begin the session. I'm delighted to introduce myself. I'm Julia Greenberg with the Open Society Foundations, and I'll be co-chairing this panel with my colleague, Fatima Hassan, also from Open Society Foundation. She's the executive director of our foundation in South Africa. And you have found yourself in this very large room in the late afternoon at a session on realizing rights in the HIV response. And I want to give you a little bit of background on the purpose of the session, and then we'll have an introduction. This is a practical session about how to do, understand, and evaluate human rights programming in the HIV response. I'm hoping that my fellow panelists will help us understand that it's deep and passionate work, but it's not rocket science. It can be evaluated, it can have results that we can talk about, it can be measurable, and it's fundable. We're going to look at the use of law and legal strategies for protecting and promoting human rights in the HIV response through various means, such as litigation, law reform, advocacy, by and for communities affected by HIV and human rights violations. And I'll say right here, and as we've seen at the conference, community mobilization, activism, community engagement, all of this is core to human rights in the HIV response, and often law is and should be the last resort. We should make change and make systemic change by raising our voices first. Finally, we're also going to look at some interesting efforts on how to integrate core human rights standards into HIV testing, prevention, and treatment services as part of fast-tracking the HIV response. We're going to understand, again, how to evaluate human rights programs, including measures to reduce stigma and discrimination, and to educate lawmakers, police, and health service providers about human rights. So a practical session, and one that I hope we all can learn a lot from. But before we begin with our panelists, I'm very delighted to introduce the First Lady of Guyana, Mrs. Granger, who's going to give us a welcome address. So I invite you to the podium.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming at this time. I thank the panel for inviting me to give these opening remarks, and I will finish in 5 minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. Rights remain a perennial issue associated with AIDS. There continues to exist in some countries and communities a reluctance to recognize and respect the equal rights of people infected with AIDS. Even in some countries where this equality may be recognized under the law, some persons charged with enforcement act according to their own personal biases and deny those rights. Yes, some progress has been made. The number of persons dying with AIDS has declined. The rate of infection has declined. More people have access to antiretroviral therapy. Mother-to-child transmission is going down. We in the Caribbean are particularly proud that 7 of the 14 member states of the Caribbean community have been certified as having zero mother-to-child transmission. And we have welcomed pre-exposure prophylaxis. And yet, challenges continue to beset us. We in the Caribbean struggle to endorse PrEP as we seek to strengthen our response to threats posed by migration due to economic hardship and political repression. A migrant population poses its own challenges to detection, care, and treatment. Women and girls who are raped and trafficked may also be unable to access care and treatment. We are unable to adequately address STIs such as syphilis, which can lead to congenital syphilis due to mother-to-child transmission, and our treatment must address both infections. The number of young people being infected is rising. This is partly due to the fact that youth may not have access to comprehensive health and family life education and to sexual and reproductive health services. Added to this, there are some who still refuse to be tested for AIDS. Key populations continue to experience stigma and discrimination, hence the disparity in prevalence when compared to the general population. This demands concerted effort at the universal, national, and community levels to ensure that no one, regardless of age, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, is stigmatized or discriminated against and has equal access to care and treatment once diagnosed. It also demands age-appropriate, comprehensive health and family life education from the nursery level, so that our children learn about themselves and are made sensitive about the differences that make up this human kaleidoscope. And this includes community involvement. In some parts of the Caribbean, we have a high number of adolescents and young people who have dropped out of school and are both illiterate and enumerate. We must reach out to them in language and through media that they understand and to which they will respond, so that they too may know their rights and source adolescent-friendly health services free from fear or opprobrium. Myths and misconceptions must be addressed. Collaboration among all sectors of society must be stepped up so that there is universal respect for human rights. Legislation which protects the rights of people living with HIV must be enforced so that no person infected is stigmatized or marginalized in the community, in the workplace, or anywhere else. Countries like mine, small-lying and low-lying coastal states, which are also developing, are not only caught in the crosshairs of global economic shocks, but are confronting even more severe weather patterns more frequently. The devastation wrought by hurricanes and typhoons, droughts and floods provoke new challenges, not least in the allocation of scarce resources. It is therefore imperative that adequate resources be set aside so we can achieve the 90-90-90 goals by 2020. We cannot afford to be complacent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Granger, and I feel compelled to say that the activism for human rights in the Caribbean, the movement for activism and human rights in the Caribbean has been one that has truly inspired me over the years. I just came from the Robert Carr Research Awards ceremony before this session and know the great work of Caribbean Vulnerable Communities Coalition. So you have great civil society behind the work you're doing in the region. So thanks very much for your welcome address. And I wanted to, before we introduce our first speaker, say that of course it's impossible to talk about the strategies to scale up human rights programming, legal strategies in the HIV response without recognizing the particularly dire anti-human rights context that we find ourselves in right now. While for the rest of the session, our speakers are going to be talking about those strategies, we really wanted to begin with a case study, some context about how human rights are going backwards and what communities can do to fight against that. And to do that, where better to start than in my home country of the United States, where we find ourselves in a bit of a pickle. And I would like to introduce Dazon Dixon Diallo. She is the founder and CEO of Sister Love, to give us a sense of what women are doing to fight back when it comes to reproductive justice and human rights in the U.S. Kanama.
Wow, I wish it was a little bit of a pickle. Yes, it's a lot more like the whole hog, but okay. So good afternoon, and I am grateful to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation, Julia and team. So I work with an organization called Sister Love in Atlanta, Georgia, and I say that out front because Atlanta is in the Deep South. The Deep South is way more than a geographical distinction in my country because of the history, cultural, economic, social, all of the things that have tied together to paint a very painful yet amazing progressive history and the advancement of Black folks, of brown folks, of indigenous folks and women folk and LGBTQ folk and a whole lot of other folks who find themselves in the margins of the experiences in the United States. And it's hard for me not to just go through a litany because the idea of how to respond to some of these issues is really rooted in the idea of intersectionality. And that's where we look at our main efforts for strategies to address key issues around sexual and reproductive health and justice for women and girls and people in the United States. So if I started with just the fact that over the last few years, we've had some critical macro legislative issues that have directly impacted our ability to make changes not only in protecting the rights we have, but we're now in the middle of trying to fighting to restore the rights and the access and the availability of services as well as protections that we were supposed to be able to enjoy for at least the last 40, almost 50 years. So we've had an erosion of our own voting rights. There's actually been a proactive effort to make sure that there are exclusions of people like Black people, poor people, working people, people who may be perceived to vote more progressively or more liberal, of students, of younger people, that the ability to actually access your constitutional and, quite frankly, God-given right, human right to practice your voice in the politic have been eroded. Pay equity, livable wages, being able to determine the economy of your own family by being able to make the money with one job full-time as opposed to 3 or 4 jobs part-time with no health care coverage, with no real security in your housing and transportation and child care. The dismantling of the Affordable Care Act and the undermining and the eroding of what is a right to abortion, a right to privacy, as well as the core fast-track moving issue of gentrification and changing how people are able to afford where they live and how they live where they live. All of these are like really big macro issues that seemingly don't look like they're sexual and reproductive justice related. But if I talked about reproductive justice in terms of what it is and what it really is, the core element, I can do all of the nice theoretical, philosophical pontificating about it, but when you boil it down, reproductive justice is really about the right to have the children that we want to have, the right not to have the children we don't want to have, and the right to parent the ones that we have. And that is not just in the reproductive context writ large. It's not so womb-centric that we're not conscious of the right of LGBTQ folks, for example, to become parents, or people living with HIV, the right to have the right information to access to how to become pregnant safely and how to give delivery to safe and healthy children. So in the face of addressing the fact that we've had attacks on Title X clinics like Planned Parenthood, on access to contraception through the health insurance schemes and platforms, that we are literally looking at around the corner the signing of a domestic rule that mirrors the Mexico City rule, also known as the Global Gag Rule, and what that critically means for women and girls living with HIV or trying to prevent HIV when most of their HIV services, testing, linkage to care programs, and all of those are located where they go most for their own services, which is reproductive health, family planning, and STD clinics, all looking at the elimination of those services through federal funding. So how do we look at building resistance in these ways? And in the context of reproductive justice, which really means we're wanting to create a place where my autonomy, my decision-making, and the environment around me is structured in such a way that I am able to do that with not just my agency, but with the resources and the supports that I need to do that. One of the key components of that in terms of intersectionality is cross-movement building. So, for example, in my organization, it's not enough to focus in on protecting our Ryan White program for funding for people living with HIV, but it's also important to make sure that we're protecting the Title X funding for people who are accessing family planning. It's also important for us to make sure we're protecting housing, affordable housing, supportive housing, and the funding for housing that people need. It's important for us to make sure that comprehensive sexual health education is still readily available to our youth. And from our youth perspective, they want our communities to also be comprehensively educated in sexual health education. And we're working also in terms of like with the court systems and fighting the efforts to replace judges with more conservative judges that would restrict these rights by looking at what the district attorneys are able to do in terms of protecting people around criminalization issues. Looking at proactive legislation. Two pieces that I will end up with and close on because they're immediately relevant, I think, to a lot of our conversations around the integration of HIV and sexual and reproductive health. One is that we've had one win because we organize around the clinics that are providing care to women who are low income and low wage in places where the state laws have restricted those clinics to the point where they are not able to even operate because they're required to build up their environment, they're required to build up their clinics to such a stage that basically you could do open heart surgery. And we know that an abortion is actually a lesser risky procedure than a root canal, and those are always done in people's private doctors' offices. So we had a case that actually won against those laws in terms of the whole women's health, and that required all of the women's rights communities to come together, those fighting violence, those fighting HIV, those who are fighting on behalf of sexual assault and violence, as well as those who are fighting for reproductive rights. And we lost a case recently at the Supreme Court, which is around literally giving crisis pregnancy centers the legal right to lie. So we're in a situation now where the lie of the day is actually made legal when we are supporting, through the law, crisis pregnancy centers to give wrong information in an anti-abortion effort to help people stay pregnant, even when they don't want to. These are all relevant, especially for women living with HIV, because there's so many mixed messages that continue to come toward them. Not only are you not supposed to be having sex in our eyes, but much less having children, then we want to make sure that you're not able to. And in that sense, there's sometimes opportunities for folks to engage in sterilization without people's knowledge. So we've had forced sterilization, lack of access to abortion, the erosion of Roe versus Wade. All of these things fit together, so we have to move together in terms of the co-movements. If I leave you with one last thought about one of my own strategies, is I listen a lot to TED Talks. And Brian Stevenson, I used to call him my movement husband, but I thought, he doesn't even know you. That might not even be appropriate. You don't even know whether he likes women or not. That ain't even an important issue. But he is my movement muse. And there are 4 tenets that I now employ and teach and train about that, if you think about it at the end of the day, fit right in with everything we do with the IAS and with what we do globally around HIV and affecting human rights change. 1, we have to be proximate to the issues. That people living with HIV have to be in the center, have to be at the table, have to be in the leadership, have to be at the beginning of the planning for your research protocols, and have to be at the end when there's the dissemination of that, and the informed consent processes as well. These things don't exist these things exist in informed consent, but they don't always exist in reality when we're talking about meaningful engagement. That we also have to be able to change the narrative. It's not enough to talk specifically about what human rights are if we're not actually implementing them in what they look like and what they mean. What I mean by that is it's enough to talk about human rights from a legal perspective, but in your own agency, are you paying all your people livable wage? Do you have an upward mobility track for people living with HIV on your staff? Do you have them on your boards of directors? Change that narrative in terms of how we engage our peers in our organizations. Protecting the hope is also important, making sure that we are giving the message that we are winning even when it feels like we're losing because they're afraid of what the win looks like. And then at the end of the day, we have to be willing to get and make people uncomfortable. Make people uncomfortable. The only thing we should be comfortable with is discomfort. Because the minute that we begin to feel comfortable around our work, around our spaces, around how we control the decisions in the places that we move, we're not trying to change anything that needs to be changed for the people that we serve. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dazon, and I think that the context that Dazon shared should surely resonate with many of you in countries around the world when it comes to the constricting rights, particularly facing women. And thanks also for the very practical TED Talk-related steps at the end. We're going to move into some strategy work now, and I'm delighted to begin our discussion in what really I consider the most significant effort the HIV response has seen to scale up human rights, which is happening at the Global Fund right now. And to talk about that is Ralph Jorgens. Ralph is the Senior Coordinator for Human Rights at the Global Fund. Prior to that, he was one of us at Open Society Foundation's work. He was the Program Director and ran our law and health work. And he was also the co-founder of the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network. Ralph.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I'm going to talk this afternoon about one of the biggest mysteries in the fight against HIV, and that is, why is everyone talking so much about how important human rights are to the response to HIV, and why is so little funding going to concrete programs that could change that could make a difference in terms of people's access to services. Now, at the Global Fund, which I joined 3 years ago, we started a project over 5 years in 20 countries to vastly increase funding going to programs to reduce human rights related barriers to services, and I'm going to talk about that. And let me start with acknowledging my colleagues at the Global Fund and the researchers that have helped us by doing research in the 20 countries that I'll be talking about. I would also like to acknowledge the Open Society Foundation. Thank you, Julia. The Ford Foundation and American Jewish World Services for financial contributions to the work that we have undertaken. Human rights is not new in the strategy of the Global Fund. In fact, already the 2012 to 2016 strategy contained a human rights objective, which was a threefold objective, integrating human rights considerations throughout the grant cycle, ensuring that the Global Fund does not support any programs that infringe human rights, and increasing investments in programs that address human rights barriers to accessing health services. We did quite well on the first two of these sub-objectives, but we did not do well at all at the Global Fund in increasing investments in programs to reduce human rights-related barriers to services. Most applications to the Global Fund included some analysis of human rights barriers to services in the country. However, the investment in the concrete programs that could make a difference and address these barriers remained at 0.7% of the overall budget for HIV, and far less for TB and malaria. And here on this graph you'll see what I call the human rights cascade. The light blue is the number of applications, and it starts with HIV, HIV-TB, TB, and then malaria. And then as the blue becomes darker, you see the number of these applications that actually contained a human rights analysis, the number that contained human rights programs, and finally the number of applications where human rights programs with a traceable budget. And as you see, for HIV, only about half of the applications had any funding going to programs to reduce human rights related barriers. For TB, hardly any. For malaria, none at all. So the Global Fund in its new strategy decided to put greater emphasis on the need to increase funding for programs to reduce human rights related barriers to services. Success, this is, I quote from the Global Fund strategy, requires moving from rhetoric to investing in the very practical programs that have been shown to reduce human rights barriers to access, increasing uptake of and retention in services, and ultimately increasing the efficiency of Global Fund investments. The Global Fund is a health financing institution, so why do we invest in human rights programs? And why is human rights one of 4 strategic objectives of our strategy? It is because it's the right thing to do, but for a health financing institution, the fact that it increases the efficiency of Global Fund investments is central. So what are we now doing to increase investment in these programs? And I'm talking about stigma and discrimination reduction programs, about programs in healthcare settings, about programs with police so that police stop interfering with the treatment and prevention efforts, stop the violence against key populations. We're talking about increasing access to justice for key populations and vulnerable populations. We're talking about putting the law into the hands of populations. We're talking about programs to reduce the gender inequality. So in 20 countries, we're doing a very intensive efforts. The board set aside additional funding for these countries. We also do an effort in all middle-income countries to increase the percentage of funding that goes to these programs, and we do a specific effort in countries that receive reduced funding from the Global Fund and may no longer receive funding in the future, recognizing that we need to increase domestic financing for these programs, not only funding from donors. These are the 20 countries in the Intensive Support Initiative. As you see, there's 13 in the African continent, and then we also have Indonesia, Philippines, Nepal, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Tunisia, Honduras, and Jamaica. So what is new and innovative about this approach? We're taking a really pragmatic and programmatic approach to human rights. There are concrete programs that have been proven to be effective in reducing in increasing people's access to services, reducing the human rights-related barriers that they face. For the first time, we're trying to take these programs to scale. Everywhere, these programs have only been implemented as pilot projects. It's very small scale. They've hardly ever been evaluated for the simple reason that it was not worth evaluating them because so little funding was spent for them. So we have done in these 20 countries, in 9 countries now, we have finished baseline assessments of human rights-related barriers to services. What do these baseline assessments do? They look at what are the barriers, but then importantly, they go further. They also look at what programs already exist in the country to reduce the barriers, and what do we know about how effective these programs are. Then we estimate what would be required over a period of 5 years to move from small scale to comprehensive programs to reduce human rights-related barriers to services, programs that really make a difference for people and increase their access to services. And finally, we also cost what this would cost over 5 years so that we finally know how much money we would need in order to reduce human rights-related barriers to services. We have already shared 9 of these baseline assessments with in-country stakeholders. Others will follow in the next months, and by the end of the year, all of these reports will be public. We have already held multi-stakeholder meetings in Ukraine and Nepal at which we have presented these reports, verified the findings in the report, and very importantly, started the concrete planning for a 5-year plan to reduce the human rights-related barriers to services. What we have seen is that there was a lot of excitement. People said, finally, we're taking these issues seriously. And we've also seen that national ownership has started of this process, with national AIDS commissions and TB commissions now leading the development of the 5-year plans and, very importantly, contributing significant national resources to these efforts. Now, the findings of the assessments in some ways are not very surprising. We find that there are lots of human rights-related barriers still, a lot of stigma and discrimination in healthcare settings, for example. We also found that many countries may have good laws, but that police violence and lack of access to justice, among other things, nevertheless prevent access to services. The findings show that we should stop talking simply about changing laws, because changing laws is not enough. You have to accompany that with the efforts to educate police, to educate healthcare providers, to put the law into the hand of the people. We need all 7 key programs to reduce stigma and discrimination and increase access to justice. Efforts to change laws and policies are only one of the 7 programs. And here are some examples of countries. Kyrgyzstan has a very favorable legal environment. Mozambique saw recent changes, positive changes. DRC has no laws criminalizing, and everywhere we see the same behavior by police and healthcare providers. So let's talk about moving beyond just changing the law, efforts to change the law. We need to change the environment as well. What we are seeing at the Global Fund is a vastly increased investment in programs to reduce human rights-related barriers to services as a result of this effort. 14 countries had their grants approved and signed off by the Global Fund, and those 14 countries in the last 3 years invested a total of $6 million to programs to reduce human rights-related barriers to services. In the next 3 years, it will be $56 million. So the investment was so small that we were able to achieve a nearly 1,000% increase. I hope that next time we will still see a relevant increase, but clearly the investments were far from enough. We are also seeing some success in increasing investments overall, not only in the 20 countries in which we have provided incentives and in which we are doing a particularly intensive efforts, but more needs to be done. And we know that we have to do more. We are considering moving from providing incentives to some countries to adopting strong policy levers so that we see all countries investing adequately in these programs. We know that we still have to increase the capacity at the Global Fund Secretariat so that all staff know and can defend programs to reduce human rights-related barriers to services in the countries for which they are responsible. We know also that, and we're seeing that increasingly, that we do need to do a lot more to increase the capacity at country level to implement these programs. Some of the countries have never implemented some of the programs we're talking about, and civil society is now in a position to do so, but we need to provide the support so that they can do it well, and we also need to make sure that the right implementers implement these programs. Thank you very much.
So we're going to move on to scaling up programming to talk a bit about integrating programming. UNAIDS has recently released practical guidance on what it means to integrate human rights standards and principles into HIV prevention, testing, and treatment. And we're delighted to have Luisa Cabal, who is the Senior Advisor for Human Rights and Gender at UNAIDS, to share the work on this integration.
So, good afternoon, everyone. As I was preparing for the presentation today on the topic, I was asked specifically around our recent guidance on integrating the human rights programs into the advocacy and the technical assistance that UNAIDS provides. I kept thinking that when we as a human rights and gender team advocate internally within UNAIDS and with partners, it was important to think of the whole package of what we try to achieve to advance human rights principles in the services and beyond. And I kept thinking of what would be helpful in terms of the message and what I wanted to share around how is it that we make the case internally within the joint program with different stakeholders, with our country offices, and how is it that we try to respond once these human rights programs are being implemented, once the funds are going down to civil society partners, to other partners to implement some of the activities that Ralph was mentioning. How is it that UNAIDS needs to be prepared to be there to support? So let me start by sharing the first thing that we need to do and we try to do is gather the evidence, put the evidence, the data that you're all producing, that researchers are producing, to make the case. And I think the most recent report that we launched just at the end of last year at the Human Rights Council Social Forum, and I have a couple of copies of that, is called Confronting Discrimination. Because I kept getting the question about, beyond you pushing us to work on eliminating human rights barriers, because it's a human rights imperative, we get it, it's a human rights obligation, show us how these human rights barriers are real obstacles to the 1990, to adherence, to testing. So what we try to do is how can we gather this evidence so that we can advocate and make the case with policymakers, but within UNAIDS around why these programmatic interventions are needed. How can we simplify in the messages how in practice, by investing in these programs and by including human rights considerations as you fast track in the response, you need to see and make the case to the policymakers at every level of the cascade why it is imperative to address these barriers and how human rights programs can help in doing so. But the other point I wanted to make is that once you make the case, I wanted to say that one of the human rights programs that the Global Fund is investing in is not enough to reform laws, but we have to be ready. What is UNAIDS doing once civil society, once those policymakers want to make that change, to support the legislators and support also the courts and human rights bodies? So this is a call for you also, that as the funds come down to you and you continue to litigate, you continue to push for law reform, for policy change, UNAIDS should be an ally, and you should be coming to us to see. In this case, we have filed amicus briefs on certain issues in national level jurisdictions as well as in regional human rights bodies or UN level human rights bodies. But it is also important that, to give an example, one of the human rights programs advocated within and that the Catalytic Investments is investing is actually addressing and training stigma and discrimination in healthcare facilities and in healthcare broadly. But we need to make sure that that political commitment is ready. And how can we make sure that those policymakers and UN country offices understand that they need to be pushing for those investments, creating demand for those investments, and for the accountability mechanisms? So we develop, how do we galvanize the support among our partners? And one such example is an agenda to address discrimination in healthcare settings, and going around our UN partners to come together in this agenda. We got 12, working with WHO, 12 UN agencies to commit to addressing stigma and discrimination in healthcare settings, including the commitment to jointly work to removing and to reforming those punitive laws against key populations, against access to reproductive health services. But also, we also understand that we need to catalyze the political leadership that will help in enabling and creating that enabling environment so that these services are successful. And that's why we also work in generating dialogue, in many cases South-South, between the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights with the African Commission on Human Rights, on how do we create spaces of dialogue and lessons learned around how to, for example, deal with LGBT rights. Or in this case, partnering with civil society, with organizations such as ARASA, collaborating with UNDP and with the African Commission on Human Rights around how the African human rights system can be expansive in protections of the rights of women, girls, and key populations. But then also, if we're creating the demand and if the services are trickling down around legal literacy and around legal services, how is the UN being prepared? And we need to have our partners and UNAIDS being prepared, and you have to also push us to make sure that when the legal services are being utilized, when there's that demand coming from the legal literacy programs, that we are also on our national level offices are able to respond to those needs and be supportive. And then I come back to where the human rights programs, and I want to underscore the importance of the guidance that UNAIDS developed, but the guidance is only so helpful as it is being implemented and as it is resourced. And that's why we find it so exciting that the Global Fund is using this guidance to say, we know that this works, and now we need to make sure that that demand, that stakeholders at the country level, civil society, but also policymakers, the NACs, our offices, the whole joint program is ready to push and to support and to provide technical advice around these 7 key human rights programs. And one of the ways in which we are doing this, and I hope we brought a couple of this, the fast track guidance that we collaborated on with some of you here, including the Canadian Legal Network, is how do we unpack? We know that we need the human rights programs, but we also need to understand that in the push to fast track and to scale up access to services, to testing, to treatment, we need to make sure that that scale up is grounded on human rights principles. So what we have done in this fast track guidance is unpack the human rights principles, and with a practical checklist on, let's do a quick assessment around how is it that our legal, our policy, our regulatory system in practice is protecting or not human rights, so that in that scale up, we make sure that human rights are protected and that the fast tracking is grounded on human rights principles. Last but not least, I think I want to tie to some of the earlier discussion that you introduced us around reproductive health and reproductive rights. One of the big challenges and opportunities are around the theme of this conference, around how is it that we're building those bridges but also crossing those bridges. And I think there's a thread, and this is a question for us. I was thinking when I was preparing my presentation around programming and inserting human rights in service provision, that I thought of it of a three-legged stool. That yes, the programming, we need to advocate for human rights in the programming, for human rights programs themselves, but also the political push that I mentioned. How is it that we push politically for the support that is needed in case of emergencies, in case the cases are being litigated and the public health data and the human rights standards and the voice of the UN is needed when needed, but also that if we have people at the center, we cannot be siloing the issues, and that we know the limitations of how effective we have been or not, because criminalization or discrimination does not exist in a silo. So what we have been doing with civil society partners, many of them in this table and in the audience, is how do we support those efforts to build bridges, to bring the scientific community outside of the laboratories to help us achieve justice, and tomorrow there will be a big announcement around this, and Edwin would probably talk about it. But also, how do we build bridges across movements challenging criminalization? So in this regard, we're working to facilitate dialogue and more concrete action, I hope, after this conference, around how do we join efforts with those working in the reproductive rights community, in the HIV criminalization efforts, in the sex work community, so that jointly we can be supportive of those efforts to challenge criminalization. So those are my initial thoughts for our conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, and I think it's important in this session to acknowledge that in recent years it had felt like HIV criminalization had fallen off the agenda. But recently, and I think thanks to our next speaker, there's been an impressive amount of mobilizing and campaigning on these issues, which I think is critically important. And to talk about that work is Edwin Bernard. He is the global coordinator of the HIV Justice Network, a global information and advocacy hub for individuals and organizations working to end HIV criminalization. Welcome.
Thanks so much. It's really a privilege to be here amongst so many amazing people. One of the things that I've never learned to do, though, is use a PC compared to a Mac. But here we go. So I'm here to talk about how we have built a movement, and we're still building it, of course, to advance HIV justice, resist HIV criminalization. And I represent the tip of an iceberg. There are so many incredible people working on this. So I want to start with my favorite quote from my favorite chapter of the incredible report of the Global Commission on HIV and the Law, the original report from 2012. There was a supplement launched yesterday. This is what it says about HIV criminalization. In much of the world, it is a crime to expose another person to HIV or to transmit it, especially through sex. Fundamentally unjust, morally harmful, and virtually impossible to enforce with any semblance of fairness, such laws impose regimes of surveillance and punishment on sexually active people living with HIV, not only in their intimate relations and reproductive and maternal lives, but also in their attempts to earn a living. And that is also a reflection of the fact that many sex workers who are living with HIV are actually prosecuted for literally working or walking whilst being a sex worker. I will talk a little bit about the problem of HIV criminalization, but really I'm here to talk really about the solutions. But what's the impact of HIV criminalization, whether that's overly broad HIV-specific criminal laws or the unjust application of general criminal laws or similar laws to people living with HIV based solely on our HIV-positive status. It really is a growing global phenomenon, and it is fortunately now being increasingly recognized as an important public health and human rights issue, including the fact that earlier this morning on this stage it was featured prominently, including having the first survivor of HIV criminalization, Robert Suttle, speak so eloquently this morning. There are all kinds of problems, selective and arbitrary prosecutions, and definitely a disproportionate impact on women and different key populations in different parts of the world. One of the problems about the laws, which are often non-disclosure laws rather than potential or perceived exposure or alleged transmission, is that they can be used for threats and abuse and retaliation when basically it's one person's word against another and the person with HIV is rarely believed by the police or courts. There are often improper and insensitive police investigations, and then when someone is accused, there's often limited access to competent defense lawyers. On top of that, there's disproportionate sentencing, 35 years for spitting on a cop, 120 years, lifetime sex offender registration, all these sorts of things. Mostly, that's most of the US, but all around the world, real problems there. And of course, stigmatizing media reporting that just creates a vicious circle. And of course, it's a barrier to HIV prevention, treatment, and care. And as as my namesake, Justice Edwin Cameron, told our Beyond Blame conference 2 years ago. We had another one yesterday. By reinforcing stigma, HIV criminalization makes it more difficult for those at risk of HIV to access testing and prevention. It also makes it more difficult for those living with the virus to talk openly about it and to be tested, treated, and supported. We presented these data today in a poster, and I'm not going to go through the detail, but the reality is that there are more HIV-specific criminal laws today than ever before, 73. And there have been more countries where cases have been reported than ever before, 76 countries. The purple is where HIV-specific criminal laws have been applied, but the general criminal law has been applied in as many countries in terms of cases, prosecutions, and convictions, and despite all of our best efforts. But there have been successes, and I will talk about some of those. So to me, what is HIV criminalization? Too many people living with HIV are being convicted of crimes contrary to international guidelines on HIV and human rights, which were written in 1998, I'll tell you, as well as contrary to scientific evidence, medical evidence, and best public health advice. And so, as well as the Global Commission's report in 2012, this is an amazing tool produced by UNAIDS. Full disclosure, I was a consultant on this, but it's an extremely important tool that provides guidance for countries on how to end the overly broad criminalization of HIV non-disclosure, exposure, and transmission. One of the things that Louisa was saying is that whilst all these tools are incredibly important and provide all kinds of guidance, it's how are they implemented, how are they disseminated, and how do communities actually use them? So let's talk about growing the global movement. So I began 11 years ago blogging about this. I actually was a reporter for AIDSmap NAM, which they're the scientific reporter for this conference, and I reported on these conferences. But I also started to notice HIV criminalization was happening, and very few people were taking notice of it. And I started blogging about it, and I came to the AIDS conference in 2008 in Mexico City, and found people were really appreciating my blog. And in fact, the data in that blog was used by Justice Edwin Cameron on the final morning plenary of that conference to call for a global movement to end HIV criminalization. And so, hey, we had the same first name. I thought, okay, let's see what we can do. So it was a struggle, unfunded for many years, then a small amount of funding, and then thank you to the Robert Carr Civil Society Network Fund, which recognized when we applied 2.5 years ago, that the issue of HIV criminalization was overlooked and underfunded, and funded a consortium to actually deal with this issue. And we've branded this as HIV Justice Worldwide, and we've had 3 strategy meetings so far. Each year we bring not just the consortium partners, but our partners and allies, including those from UNAIDS and UNDP and others, to my home in Brighton to talk about how we actually end HIV criminalization together. This is the steering committee of HIV Justice Worldwide. Most of us are funded through the consortium, but this is a broader coalition, and importantly, it involves global and regional networks of people living with HIV. This is a movement that is led by networks of people living with HIV, but very much in partnership with incredible legal and human rights organizations, including the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network and ARASA and SALC. And really, Robert Carr Fund, thank you so much. It felt like winning the lottery the day I heard that we'd been funded. One of the many things that we've been able to do, of course, is pull together. There have been so many tools produced around HIV criminalization over the year, but they were never really pulled together in a toolkit. So we were able, one of the many things we've been able to do is pull together a toolkit. We've also produced a media toolkit. I talked about stigmatizing media reporting and how problematic that is. We've produced a toolkit for how to deal with the media. And one of the other things that's been so important to us is that we've been able to work with communities and networks in the region, and we have not only been able to uncover what we thought were hidden applications of HIV criminalization laws, particularly in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Russia has had 900 cases since 1997. Belarus is the criminalization hotspot in the world right now. Last year, in one region alone, 50 cases in the first 6 months. We've been able to link through networks particularly of women living with HIV. The Eurasian Women's Network on AIDS has done incredible work on the ground. And helping to build capacity. The same with Francophone Africa and the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network have done incredible work using their experience and their Francophone ability to link the movements that are happening in Francophone Africa, a burgeoning network there on HIV criminalization, including just this week the DRC, the networks in DRC were able to announce they removed an HIV-specific law there. So that's been remarkable. You can see many of the other milestones on our website. We've done so much. I just want to highlight two things that we've been able to do that I'm particularly proud of. So when we first started, one of our partners, or two of our partners, Zero and the Positive Women's Network, are in the United States, and they put together this incredible training academy called HIV is Not a Crime. And in 2016, we were able to bring advocates not just from Canada but also from Mexico to basically learn and strategize together. That helped support a movement in Veracruz State in Mexico, which was the only state that actually had just passed an HIV-specific law in the entire country. And we supported, along with the local networks and the Human Rights Commission, a constitutional challenge. And it took a long time to get to the courts, but we heard just a few months ago that they were successful and that HIV criminalization was deemed unconstitutional in Mexico. And we hope that will have resonance for the entire Latin American and Caribbean region. But also Malawi. There are many omnibus HIV/AIDS laws throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Malawi had been discussing theirs since 2008, but had not enacted it. Finally, there was pressure, all kinds of pressure, to pass an omnibus HIV/AIDS law, but it had a number of really problematic provisions. Many of those were removed thanks to dialogues with UNAIDS and UNDP and civil society. But it felt like there was one provision left, willful transmission of HIV, that was felt to be just sort of, well, all the other countries in sub-Saharan Africa have these, if we can just get the law passed, let's leave it in there. But thanks to all kinds of community-based mobilization, including incredible partners in Malawi themselves, we provided a small grant that helped mobilize women living with HIV who went to Parliament and basically said, do not pass this law. HIV criminalization laws do not protect women, they harm women. And they listened. They passed the law without that problematic provision. Louisa mentioned also how we need to bring science to justice, and we've been consulted for many. Well, basically, we took the idea many years ago to UNAIDS and said, look, your guidance in 2013 is extremely useful, but unfortunately it's not detailed enough about the science. And we know there's lots of ways that scientists, if we can just engage the scientists to be expert witnesses and be consistent about talking about what are the possibilities of transmission and what is the harm of HIV in the context of treatment, and how it's not really possible, despite lots of people believing it is, to on its own use phylogenetic analysis to prove one person infected another. So there has been this, tomorrow there will be launched this expert consensus statement on the science of HIV in the context of criminal law, supported by IAPAC, IS and UNAIDS. And we really hope that this is going to be a key reference for clarifying important issues of HIV science in the context of criminal law. Science alone is not the answer. Science is part of the answer, but it's a huge step. Yesterday we had our third Beyond Blame. There's been lots of conversations about building this intersectional movement. It's the theme almost of the panel. It's something that we also care about. We had the most incredible panel on women in HIV criminalization, bringing all kinds of feminist perspectives, but also and talking about the pitfalls of using just science and advocacy. But also there was an incredible panel on intersectionality and how do we build this movement. And I think that we need to do that by ensuring that funders don't ask that we work in silos constantly, that our programs move beyond that. And so I'm very happy to hear about Ralph and the Global Funds programs too, and maybe we can start working together in those key countries. So how does it work? How do you build a movement? Well, it's a not so simple equation. Human rights plus science, communities plus intersectionality, coordination and funding, and what do you get? HIV justice worldwide. Thank you.
Thanks, and I think in Edwin's presentation we saw absolutely how we can effectively measure human rights programming. And for our last presentation, I'm delighted to welcome Alexandrina Ayvita from the Global Fund. She recently joined as a technical advisor on human rights after many years at UNAIDS, and she's going to talk about making change and measuring impact. And I feel, just to keep Alexandrina on her toes and that I admire her work so much, just to reflect for a second about evaluation and impact. Alexandrina and I once worked on a report that showed that less than 1% of all donor funding, private and bilateral, went to human rights interventions, less than 1%. And yet we are just asking so much of our grantees and the people doing their work when it comes to impact and evaluation. It's not commensurate with what we give. And also, in the world that Dazon so well described, and that the world that we're seeing that drug users are living through in the Philippines and in Russia, anti-human rights and women's rights backlash around the world, the fear is that we won't see impact because of the embattled nature of the lives of the very people that these programs are trying to serve. So I think we need to understand evaluation and impact in that context. And I think that learning from Alexandrina about how to do this will be of enormous value to all of us. Thank you.
No pressure whatsoever. Thank you, Julia. We've heard about the fact that the need for human rights programs is dire, today and always. We've heard that there is actually a case being made by UNAIDS, and there is guidance that has been developed, and there is commitment. We've also heard that Global Fund, a major international funding mechanism, recognizes that there is no impact without breaking down barriers. So why, 30 years plus into the AIDS response, do we still need to demonstrate the value of our work? Why this skepticism? Why there is always this constant ask of showing us the evidence? Sometimes the programs to reduce human rights-related barriers are actually held to a higher burden of proof than your usual biomedical interventions. It's easy to count pills. It's less so to see how attitudes have shifted, how practices, abusive practices, have changed. It's not simple to measure something that is as complex as programs to reduce human rights-related barriers, because of their dual character. First and foremost, because it's the right thing to do. It's about our own rights. It's about the rights of every one of us. But also it's because of their role as enablers of making programs, public health programs, work. The more to measure, the more difficult it is to do so. So the perception that the results are less tangible. How do you assess attitudes? How do you assess shifts in stigmatizing attitudes in people? How do you assess practices of police, of healthcare providers? But also the very breadth of what we're trying to measure. The fact that the theories of change are not that simple. It's not that simple to link changing a law or changing a policy or changing a practice or changing the attitude in the general population, in communities, in healthcare settings, in workplaces with your usual health outcomes. So because of how convoluted the theories of change are, it is complicated to actually try to measure the outcome of our work. Ralph has also mentioned that these programs have been so direly underfunded. When there is no money to actually do the work, to defend and uphold the rights of people, it's even less so probable to be able to allocate some money to evaluate the programs. However, this turns into a vicious circle. We do not evaluate, we're not able to demonstrate the impact of our work, and as a result, we're not able to secure the resources we need to do our work properly. This is going to be a quiz, that's why I'm showing you this cascade again, adapted out of a confronting discrimination report from UNAIDS. But actually, the reason why the slide is up there is to show you that there is actually evidence that barriers interfere throughout the cascade. There is evidence that stigma and discrimination are associated with poor health outcomes. People are more likely to have HIV or STIs if they have been victims of stigma and discrimination. People are less likely to seek services if they have been victims of stigma and discrimination. There is also evidence that human rights programs work. There have been a number of systematic reviews. There was also a review of evidence that has been commissioned by the Global Fund to inform our technical brief, to inform the guidance that we're providing to implementers of human rights programs. There is a consistent and growing body of evidence that shows that programs work, and they work best when they are implemented at scale. One-off little trainings, regretfully, do not manage to shift the needle and to change attitudes and practices. These programs also work best when they are part of a comprehensive approach, so that we don't focus on laws alone, but we also remember about the need to enforce protective laws or to minimize the enforcement of bad laws. Also, these programs work best when they are integrated. They shouldn't be separate silos. They need to be integrated in the key population service delivery. They need to be integrated in the HIV services, because that's when they are cheapest and most effective to implement. They also work best when they're institutionalized. We can't afford to do one-off trainings anymore, particularly in an environment of shrinking resources for the AIDS response. We need to think how to do it better, how to do it smarter, how to do it more efficiently. We've also been blamed that we do not have enough data to show that our programs work, particularly not enough quantitative data. However, data sources exist. The surveys that we use to show the progress in improving coverage with our usual HIV programs, prevention programs, treatment, these are all surveys and instruments that can be used to show how we've done better in terms of addressing human rights-related barriers. The Stigma Index is a wonderful wealth of information. Integrated biobehavioral surveillance. It has a module on stigma, discrimination, and shame, a module on violence and harassment. We have to use these instruments to make sure that this data is being collected, to make sure that this data is being analyzed and it's being used to inform programs. But the data is out there. A wonderful advocacy tool is the Global AIDS Monitoring reporting. Once per year, every country is reporting on progress, on upholding the commitments in the political declaration, the most recent, 2016. The Global AIDS Monitoring includes indicators on stigma and discrimination, and it includes a national commitments and policies instrument that is being filled in every 2 years. We've seen the progress. Since 2003, when the first international reporting round, then called the UNGAS, has rolled around, we had 2 policy questions and 1 indicator. Now in 2017, we had 50 questions. 50 questions that looked at the laws, policies, and practices and programs. 50 questions that used the databases maintained by civil society to pre-populate the responses, and then asked the countries to provide evidence if they were saying that civil society did not get it right. We also have 3 concrete indicators. One of them actually disaggregated per 3 of the key populations, people who use drugs, sex workers, MSM. So the Global AIDS Monitoring is actually looking at collecting that data from the states. And that's a powerful advocacy tool to get the national monitoring and evaluation system to be serious about the data that they collect, about the programs that we implement. However, those indicators and surveys, they're only as good as we make them. And it is important that we complement the little quantitative indicators also with qualitative data that helps us contextualize and understand the why. Why is it that stigma and discrimination still persists? What are the human rights-related barriers that require a priority focus, and how do we do it? And people who use drugs, men having sex with men, sex workers, people living with HIV, trans people, they are the ones who know best the lived realities. They know best why the barriers are so difficult to disintegrate and why stigma and discrimination and human rights barriers are so insidious. Also, we haven't done enough to use routine program monitoring. Each one of us, implementers of programs, has a wealth of data, treasure trove of data that we're sitting on, but that data is not being aggregated up and is not used to inform efforts. It's not used to inform funding decisions. And we need to do better about collecting that routine program monitoring data, but also use that routine program monitoring data to tell a narrative, to weave a story. It's important that we stop focusing on barriers alone. We have the evidence that shows that barriers are problematic, that stigma and discrimination has a disastrous effect. So let's change the paradigm a bit. Let's shift from measuring only problems to measuring problems, but also measuring our successes. The existing evaluations, the few evaluations that exist, already show us important lessons learned. However, we need to have more programs, to which hopefully the Global Fund initiative and the hugely scaled up level of investment is going to contribute, but we also need to have more evaluations in place. We need to use those evaluations and that data to actually build conceptual frameworks and build the theories of change that take us to the public health outcomes. We need to look at the milestones that take us to the public health outcomes, so that we're not measuring impact alone, but we have the full path trailed up. We have a full path underpinned by evidence. And it's also important that we actually are a bit more holistic. We don't focus on stigma and discrimination alone, but we look at all the other human rights-related barriers that interfere with the success of our programs. However, it's also important to understand how the programs reinforce each other and build upon each other. That's why we need to look at the whole, but also at the details. And this is what the Global Fund is trying to do in partnership with you, with each and every one of you. We've been trying to bridge that divide between the evaluators and the researchers and the implementers of human rights programs. And we have an expert working group that was established by the Global Fund to guide us to do so. We, in these 20 countries where we are scaling up investments, are also assessing the barriers and the existing programs at baseline, but we'll come back and revisit at midterm and end term. How have we fared towards progressing towards a comprehensive response? Are we doing the right thing with the money that we're investing in those countries? The successful outcome in those 20 countries will be whether the access to services, utilization, retention to services has improved. Well, in order to be able to measure progress towards comprehensiveness, we first needed to define what comprehensive human rights responses are. We do have comprehensive packages services for key populations. However, no one has really articulated what does it mean to have a comprehensive response to human rights-related barriers. So we've consulted with you, we've consulted with partners in order to try to come up with a definition that could be measured. We also are aware that the Global Fund investments are important contributors to the success of the human rights programs. That's why we are trying to make our own performance frameworks less blind to the results of the human rights programs. We are working with our colleagues internally to amend the core indicator list of the Global Fund so that they include some of these great indicators that already exist. And we are able actually to understand better how the sub-recipients, the sub-sub-recipients are faring in terms of implementing the more than $60 million that we're going to have invested in these 20 countries, but also beyond. So I spoke about defining comprehensiveness and trying to measure comprehensiveness. How are we going to do that? There is a scorecard that is going to be filled in not only at baseline, work in progress, but also at midterm and end term. And we'll also be looking at existing quantitative indicators as proxy indicators to help us guide the way, so that we understand whether the programs, the right programs, are delivered in the right places for the right people at the right scale and level of investment to be able to effect change. And finally, so I keep it short and sweet, some key takeaways. We need to do more. More not in terms of necessarily breadth of activities, but focus of our activities, making them more efficient and effective. We also need to be better at measuring and documenting the results of our work. It's important that we also apply the same standard of rigor, not more rigorous, not higher burden of proof, but also not less rigorous than evaluations of any other area of programs. It's also important that we collectively look for possibilities of doing longer-term evaluations that are able to really demonstrate impact. And we use that information to tell a story, to weave a theory of change, to understand how are we going to deliver on the results that we're trying to deliver. We shouldn't also overlook the importance of understanding how much these programs cost, but also how cost-effective they are with relatively limited investments. And it's important to collect that data to be able to do the analysis and tell that story. But perhaps the most important takeaway for me personally, and I hope for each one of you, is that we are in it together. Unless we work together and each one of us brings the value added to the process, we're not going to be successful. So in order to demonstrate impact, in order to show results of our work, each one of us, from activists to policymakers to researchers to funders, we all have a role to play. Let's work together to be able to demonstrate impact and once and for all show how important it is to break down barriers and to have impact. Thank you.
I'm hoping this microphone is working. So firstly, thank you to all of you for actually staying for the evening session. I know there's a heat wave, so we really appreciate you being indoors with us. I just want to say thank you to the speakers, I think, for all of your effort and for 6 really amazing, interesting presentations, which I'm going to attempt to summarize. And also thank you to my co-chair, Julia, for, I think, arranging this entire panel and the sessions and the inputs and introducing everybody and keeping time. So, I mean, it's a bit of a deja vu, right, Ralph? We were talking about criminalization in 1998. It's 2018, so I really cannot believe 20 years have passed and we've actually regressed. Well, not we. I think governments have, and I think the legal systems have. So these are not new issues. Stigma, discrimination were the initial responses to the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 80s. And so in a way, it was a bit disillusioning to listen to the presentations because it felt like we thought we had made so many advances in terms of access to treatment and services and reduction in prices of medicines over the last 20, 25 years, but it feels like we've taken some severe steps backward, and it's probably time to revitalize those kinds of coalitions and alliances to try and address that. And there's a lot of people here in the room, some of whom are wearing their HIV positive t-shirt, I think, who know too well what the absence of human rights means when you're trying to access healthcare services. And I think one of the takeaways from today's presentation and also from yesterday's opening ceremony was that in some setting 40% of transgendered people do not access healthcare services because of the fear of stigma and discrimination. And those are the levels of stigma and discrimination we were dealing with in the late 80s. So just a few key themes that I think that have emerged from the 6 presentations today. I think the one obvious one is obviously that there's a backlash which is showing itself up in 4 different ways. The one is ideology, and I think most evident in terms of what's happening with the Trump administration in the US and how that's having an impact on sexual and reproductive health rights in particular, and a global backlash which has always been brewing, but I think more pronounced now in relation to the right of women and girls to exercise the right to terminate an unwanted pregnancy. The second way in which it's showing up again, as in the early 80s, is high levels of stigma and discrimination and othering. The third is it's actually quite evident in our criminal justice system, and hopefully at the end of this conference there will be a concerted response to deal with that. And in relation to the criminal justice system is the introduction and passing of laws that are criminalizing people who are HIV positive. And I think from today's presentations, a clear distinction between laws that are progressive in settings where laws that can protect people living with HIV, and in other settings where laws are used to criminalize people living with HIV, which then have socioeconomic impacts and consequences, which I think this morning's opening clearly articulated. And then from today's presentations, leading to selective prosecutions and then also disproportionate sentencing, which has a severe socioeconomic impact on already vulnerable and marginalized populations. I mean, obviously a lot was said, which we all agree with, in terms of law has to be in the hands of communities, there has to be self-empowerment, and communities, I think, as Sandra quite eloquently described, have to be the ones that are driving legal reform and policy change, because if you leave it to the officials in the White House, then what you will end up with is a distorted interpretation of laws like the Global Gag Rule, or for that matter, the administrations in many other governments. And I think the warning that really came out from today was that if we only focus on the Trump administration, we are going to forget about Belarus, we're going to forget about Malawi, and we're going to forget about many other countries where laws are very surreptitiously and silently being passed to criminalize people living with HIV, which will reverse the entire set of treatment advances we have made over the last 25 years. I think what was compelling, Julia, was the question around what incentives can we offer. I can't believe in 2018 we have to talk about incentives to governments and multilateral institutions and donors and communities to actually protect and to respect human rights. But be that as it may, we probably have to think of some incentives. Maybe they have to be negative incentives. Maybe you haul a government well, you can't actually take the US because they've withdrawn from the Human Rights Council. So you're probably going to have to think of other creative ways in which you can hold governments to account. And then finally, I think the argument around, well, not the argument, but I think the point around intersectionality is that if we are going to deal with this issue of the criminal justice system and the selective prosecution, again, of people living with HIV and AIDS, and it reminds us, I think, of what was happening 20 years ago, where if you were living with HIV, you couldn't get access to housing, you couldn't get access to education, you couldn't get life insurance, you were disproportionately targeted and prosecuted and denied financial benefits, civil and political rights, and socioeconomic rights, and it seems to be re-emerging again. But yeah, the issue of transgender rights, injecting drug users, men who have sex with men, sex workers, forced sterilization, termination, travel restriction, women and girls, migrants. Sandra raised the issue of migrants and populations who are on the move. And for each of those categories, there are different laws that are targeting different groups. So while we need to deal with a global response to criminalization of people living with HIV within each of those groups, we're probably going to have to think through specific strategies to address multiple groups that are all facing the impact of HIV and facing the impact of the criminal justice system globally. I think quote of the day should really be that UNAIDS should be an ally. I'm sure in the questions some of you will probe that. How can UNAIDS be a greater ally in the fight? And presumably we could include the Global Fund there as well. And then some clear recommendations that were coming from the presentations for those of you who are funders like us, but also for those of you working in communities. I think four recommendations quite clearly coming out. The one is train healthcare workers who are still seen as the first point at which people experience sort of high levels of stigma and discrimination, which would prevent people from accessing much needed life-saving services. And then the second, again, was actually training of police officials, and I think that came out in at least 3 of the presentations today. The third is around what Edwin and also Alan this morning had talked about, that is integrating science in law. So if we are going to have an effective response to the criminalization efforts, then we have to rely once again on our scientific comrades who are in the scientific arena and in the medical community. So it's kind of a reminder of how we had to work with them in the 80s and the 90s, and reference was made to the statement that will be released tomorrow. And then finally, I think, following on from some of the presentations around the need for a criminal law watch, which probably has to be located at a multilateral institution that has access to people in power, that has access to prime ministers and presidents and high-ranking government officials, so that there can be a global effort to challenge each country by country the laws that are being passed, similar to the work that activists are doing around supporting each other globally in terms of intellectual property, or what's known as the IP Global Watch. So we're going to open up to some questions because we actually do have a few minutes. So I see a long queue over there. I'm kidding. Here's your chance. I see Comrade Anelia there at mic 2, and I see somebody at mic 9. Is there anybody else? Then let's start with Anelia at mic 2.
Good day, colleagues. I'm Aneleawa. I'm from South Africa. And in South Africa, we know what discrimination is because we are products of apartheid, which was declared as a crime against humanity. As I'm standing here, a week ago, Human Science Research Council just released a report which was telling us a day in South Africa, there's an estimated number of about 600 people who are infected with HIV on daily basis. Therefore, I've got questions for all of you standing there. You will choose which one to answer. But let me start with the UNAIDS. UNAIDS came with ambitious targets, 1990, and the AIDS by 2030. How do you think that in a country, for instance, like South Africa, where there are about 600 new HIV infections daily, how do you think we can end AIDS by 2030? Yet you know that our healthcare system is broken. Secondly, health, we all know that health is a fundamental human right. Why world bodies like your WHO, UNAIDS, you name them all, why they are quiet when our governments are not improving access to quality healthcare services? Two, which one is important between nursing diplomatic relations with our governments and standing up for human rights? Three, we all know that AIDS response. Thanks.
Number 9.
Hello, my name is Valeria Rachinska. I'm from Ukraine. I will speak Russian, and my colleague will translate to you. У меня мой вопрос о умышленности передачи ВИЧ. Мой вопрос к Эдвину и к Александрине. Значит, он заключается в том, UNAIDS дает рекомендацию о том, что исключить из законодательства специфические законы, направленные на ВИЧ-инфекцию, и оставить только умышленность передачи ВИЧ-инфекции. Но у меня вопрос, как ВИЧ-позитивный человек может доказать, что передача произошла неумышленно? И где эта тонкая грань между умышленностью и неумышленностью? Кто ее будет определять? Это вопрос к Эдвину и вопрос к Александрине. Какие рекомендации глобального фонда? Что Александрина думает, что это по этому поводу? Спасибо.
So, the question is addressed to Edwin and Alexandrina, and it relates to the recommendation of UNAIDS to leave only intentional transmission of HIV criminalized, while deleting other provision criminalizing unintentional provision, etc. And the question is, but in case of intentional transmission, especially in corrupted countries, it could be problematic to build right evidence that there is no intention, that there was no, in fact, this subjective side of intention. So what are the views of?
Thanks. We'll take the last question at number 2.
Thank you. Yinka from Nigeria. I was wondering, and thank GF for the support, especially to the 20 countries, and the fact that when the presentations were made, we know we have some laws that are criminalizing KP activities, but we also have progressive laws in the country, like the 2014 HIV Anti-Discrimination Act. Nigeria was not mentioned as one of the countries, and we also, because of the burden of the virus in the country and the fact that we have quite coordinated response, especially around gender and human rights, to empower KP and to ensure their MIPA. We were wondering why Nigeria is not one of the 20 countries, and what are the opportunities to expand on the current platform we have developed in the country to support KPRI, especially in popularizing progressive laws and improving access to justice.
Thanks. I've noticed there is a fourth question, but we'll just try and answer the first 3 if you wouldn't mind bearing with us. So over to UNAIDS first, and then Alexandrina, and I think the other panel members could potentially come in.
Well, I think that for me the bottom line is around accountability and how can human rights programs and how can we all be catalytic for the change and the accountability that needs to happen from the local level all the way to the national level and to agencies, UN agencies, WHO, UNAIDS, all of us. I think that at the bottom line is also one of the threads of this panel has been, why has it been taking so long to invest on what we know works? Mm-hmm. You mentioned Julia, the 1% investment on the human rights programs and on tackling the structural drivers of the epidemic. So I think accountability, hold us accountable to really facilitate and do the political push for the interventions that work. And let's find the allies where we can find them.
I think there was a question about what's more important, diplomatic relations or human rights?
Well, I mentioned that I believed in 3 Ps, that I was not going to talk about just programming, because programming would not be enough without a political push, with what the other P that I mentioned, with that political push. And the political push is around accountability for human rights obligations. But at the end of the day, it's not just about the programming. We won't program ourselves out of the epidemic. It's the political push. Where there's no political will, there needs to be political push. But at the end of the day, it's about the people. And it's about how do we make sure whatever the strategy, is it diplomatic, is it non-diplomatic, is it litigation, is it protest, to get to what people need.
Thanks. And then the question from Ukraine on intentional transmission in the definition.
So I'm happy to take that. So the recommendations have began in 1998 on these international guidelines on HIV and human rights, and they've been reiterated again in 2008 guidance from UNAIDS and UNDP, and by the Global Commission in 2012, and this UNAIDS guidance are highlighted in 2013. And what the recommendation is, there should be no HIV-specific criminal law, and that the general law should suffice for the extremely rare case of someone who maliciously sets out to infect someone with HIV and in fact does so. Those recommendations have been around for 20 years. Implementing those recommendations is easier said than done. I also should mention that Ukraine, after the United States, Russia and Belarus, has the next highest number of cases that we've seen in the last few years. So what we would like to see is that there's no specific law, and that people with HIV are treated fairly in court and are treated with all of the other legal and human rights principles that all cases require. So there has to be proven the mens rea, the intent has to be proven beyond all reasonable doubt. And that's incredibly difficult to prove. In our audit of cases, of global cases in the last 2.5 years, we have found out of the over 650 cases that we've looked at throughout the world, perhaps 1 or 2 where that criterion has actually sufficed. So you can say that nearly every prosecution that we've seen around the world does not reach that level of a malicious intent, which is what is recommended.
Спасибо, Valeria. I'll just add to the excellent comment by Edwin that Global Fund is funding programs, including legal services, including advocacy and monitoring for law reform. So use the tools, use the investments from the Global Fund to be able to ensure that the test of science is properly applied.
Ralph, you want to say anything? Dazon, you want to say anything?
The only thing I think that will need to be added here is that the role that we haven't talked about a lot, in addition to the populations, is the role that community-based participatory or community-based organizations and the role that they play in the research, the data collection, the stories, the case finding, that there's a lot of that goes on at the community level that's not necessarily incorporated when engaging. A lot of these are dealing with more individual issues and not necessarily looking at what's happening to community-based organizations also across the board in many different countries in terms of where they are able to stand on issues, how they're able to organize on issues. So it's not only the gag rule, for example, for those of us who are delivering reproductive health services and HIV services where people need them the most, but it is also, if you're not able to talk about the criminalization policies that are going on and how that's related to your ability to either raise funds or build partnerships where they need it to be built. We have some of those struggles just working with our own departments of health or working with our local jail systems. And so the ability and the capacity of community-based organizations to be directly engaged in a lot of the strategies that are employed by the fund and by UNAIDS and by international coalitions also must look at the membership participation and the capacity of the community organizations to which most of the individuals belong or look to for the place of relief.
So we have a final question at number 2.
Good evening. My name is Mirinyati from South Africa. My question was sparked by Comrade Alexandria's presentation on how important monitoring and evaluation is with regards to making sure that we are able to make it visible, the level of the work that we do at ground level. I sometimes feel like the expectations of M&E procedures are limiting depending on the interpretation of each program that is expected to deliver on a certain criteria or job. But my question would be, when will the UNAIDS and other programs stop chasing numbers and better focus on advocacy and activism issues, especially at local level, because some of us only get opportunities like this once in a lifetime. Thank you.
Thanks. Is there any final questions? We'll answer and then we'll be able to wrap up the panel. Thanks. Over to you.
It's very well said. We have to stop chasing numbers just for the sake of numbers. The numbers need to help us tell a story. Tell a story about the level of effort, tell a story about what we managed to deliver through that level of effort. And unless we do that, the reality is that it's going to be very difficult to be able to secure continued investment to be able to implement those programs. However, in chasing those numbers, we need to strike a fine balance, not to forget about quality of what we are doing, even if it means sometimes serving less people in the short term, even if it means in the short term to be able to invest more efforts. So it's important not to forget about the qualitative element of what we do. And that's why let's not stick only to indicators that are quantitative, that are numbers. Let's never forget about the qualitative back end. Let's never forget about the narrative that explains where the numbers are coming from and what are they telling us.
Thanks. Ralph, is there anything you maybe want to add as somebody who hasn't?
Just really coming back to what I said at the very beginning, it's a mystery why after so many years we're still spending so little on the programs that will make a difference. So in the future, when you hear people like yesterday, everyone talks about human rights, that rhetoric is everywhere. Ask them to talk about what money they're putting behind efforts to reduce human rights-related barriers to services.
Thank you. So I think that is a wrap. Thank you to the speakers.